One of the most common questions I get from teachers is, how do I manage behavior in the thinking classroom? I get it, right? The institutional normative structures of traditional classrooms come with certain advantages. Although they were designed for conformity and compliance, what they also offer us is control. And as we start to implement building thinking classrooms, as we start to replace those normative practices with thinking classroom practices, we lose that conformity compliance. What we gain is thinking, but what we also lose is control. On top of that, the more we implement thinking classrooms and the deeper we get into the practices, the more we're calling on students to become autonomous. And students don't always seize on the autonomy we give them with the best of intentions. So I get it. There are behavioral problems in a thinking classroom. Another question I often get from teachers is, how do I manage a student who is fill in the blank? How do I include a student who's a language learner? So what do I do with a student who's on the autism spectrum? How do I find ways to involve a student who's highly anxious, right? And these questions are not so much about behavior. They are, but they're not only about behavior. They're also about finding ways to include these students into the thinking classroom. Well, for those of you who have read all of Building Thinking Classrooms or have been implementing it for a while, you know that the answer to both of these questions is in Chapter 12, evaluating what we value. And more specifically, co-constructing those behavioral rubrics that we can use to shape student behavior in the classroom. The problem with Chapter 12 is that it's in Toolkit 4. Which means that if we're following the developmental framework of building thinking classrooms, we're not getting to chapter 12 until weeks, maybe months into our journey into building a thinking classroom. So now, why is chapter 12 in Toolkit 4? Well, when I first started doing the research on building thinking classrooms, um, chapter 12, evaluating what you value, was perceived by teachers to belong very clearly to the set of practices that involve assessment and evaluation. And these teachers were encountering these practices, these building thinking classroom practices for the very first time. And it was more than enough for them to be thinking about random groups and vertical whiteboards and defunding the classroom and not answering questions. They didn't want to have anything to do with anything that had to do with evaluation and assessment. And so chapter 12 ended up in toolkit number 4. Well, this is not true anymore, right? Teachers who come to building thinking classrooms now are familiar with it to some degree. Maybe they've read the book, or they've listened to a podcast, or they saw me give a keynote at a conference, or they have a colleague in their school doing it. Maybe they're part of a book study. Whatever it is, teachers are coming to thinking classrooms with more information about what it is before they even start. So chapter 12 doesn't necessarily have to belong in Toolkit 4 anymore. I gave a talk at the Building Thinking Classroom Conference in the summer of 2025 about how important it is to shift our thinking towards developing student competencies. And in order to do that, we're going to have to really drill into chapter 12 and to take advantage of some of the tools it offers us, and then to reap some of the benefits that come from that. And I also argued that because chapter 12 is so instrumental, we need to move it further up into the developmental framework, into Toolkit 2. Since giving that talk, I've been analyzing some quantitative data on how students perform on individualized, standardized assessments. I know. Building thinking classrooms is all about having students learning together. And it's all about the thinking. And I haven't been overly concerned about how they actually perform on quantitative standardized assessments. But the data exists. Almost all of you are working with students who at some point are going to write some sort of a standardized assessment. So the data exists. And of late, I've been analyzing this data and looking in particular at which practices are actually creating the biggest change in student individualized performance on standardized assessment. And I was shocked to discover that the practice that makes the biggest difference is chapter 12. How we how we shape students' behavior in the thinking classroom has the biggest impact on how they perform individually. And this is a really strong argument for why chapter 12 should actually now belong in toolkit 1, along with thinking tasks, random groups, and vertical whiteboards. But to do that, we're going to have to streamline it. If we want to implement some of the ideas of chapter 12 on, for example, students' first experience with thinking classrooms, we're going to have to streamline it. And that's what I spent the summer of 2025 thinking about, is what would this look like? What would it look like if I wanted to do this on day one of a student's experience? Well, I spent the summer thinking about it, and then I started implementing it in September in classrooms. So my first experience was I was in an Algebra 1 class of students who had never done thinking classrooms or in any substantial way with their teacher this year. And I launched the same way I always do. I called the students to a whiteboard. I drew their attention to the fact that there was whiteboards all around the room. I told them that today you're going to work at the whiteboards in random groups. But there's only one whiteboard marker at every board. So they're going to have to share it. And here's the key, then I said, what I want to see you doing while you're in your groups at your whiteboards is I want to see you collaborating. What I don't want to see you do is turn taking. Now, turn and talk, what is the difference between collaborating and turn taking? And while they were turning and talking, I drew an arrow at the top of their whiteboard, right? And it's a one-way arrow. And on the left side, I wrote the word turn taking. And on the right side, I wrote collaborating. And they were busy talking about what the difference is between the two. And then I called their attention back to me and I said, okay, somebody tell me, what is turn taking? And right away, a student was able to say, turn taking is where I do the first question, and then one of my partners does a second question, and then one of my other partners does a third question. And I'm like, yes, that is turn taking. Awesome. Question for you. While this student is doing question 1, what are the other 2 students doing? And the class as a whole kind of said, nothing. They're doing nothing. I said, they're doing, on a good day, they're doing nothing. What are they doing on a bad day? And the students start to share. They're looking at their cell phone. They're talking to their partner about something other than math. They're walking across the room to visit a friend. They're just staring into nothingness. They're goofing off. They're doing other things. And I said, right. So today we don't want to see turn taking. We want to see collaborating. So what does collaborating look like? And right away, a student shared, collaborating is where we all work together. There's only one marker, but we're all talking and sharing ideas, and one person is writing. I said, okay, anything else? One student said, we're all asking each other questions, we're offering ideas. Another student said, we're all taking responsibility for the work. I said, okay, awesome. This is what I want to see today. What I want to see, and I pointed at the arrow. I said, what I want to see is collaborating, and I pointed at collaborating. What I don't want to see is turn taking. And then we got into the math. I launched the task and off they went. And I asked them all to draw a copy of this arrow at the top of their whiteboard. Turn taking at one end, collaborating at the other. It's a one-way arrow. We're going towards collaborating. We want to see this. We don't want to see that. And then they got busy with the math. And as they were working, after about 6-7 minutes, I started interacting with groups. I'd come up to a group and I would say, all right, everybody hold up a finger. And then I'd say, at the count of 3, I want you to point at the arrow. If you think you're turn taking, point at this end. If you think you're collaborating, point at that end. If you think you're somewhere at the middle, point in the middle. 1, 2, 3, and they all pointed. And then I took my red marker and I made a mark on this arrow, approximately somewhere in the middle of their fingers. And I said, okay, nice. You're doing pretty good, but I see that there's room for improvement. So what are you going to do to improve? What are you going to do to get better, to become better at collaborating? The first group I interacted with, they said, we're going to talk more. I said, fine. And I wrote under the red mark, talk more. I said, awesome. I want you to focus on this. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to be watching you and I'm going to come back and we're going to see if you've been talking more. And then I went to the next group. Same thing. Count of 3, point. What are you going to do? We're going to ask each other more questions. Awesome. I wrote underneath the red mark, ask more questions. Right? The next group, they didn't have anything. They needed to improve, but they didn't know what to say. I said, well, here's one for you. How about we talk first, write second to get you talking more? Why don't we put down the marker and we talk first and then we pick up the marker and we write? And they like that. So I wrote talk more, write second. Next group also had nothing to say. I said, well, how about you look at each other when you're talking to each other? And so they agreed to that and I wrote that. The beauty of this, we call them single indicator rubrics, very much like chapter 12, except they're streamlined versions, is twofold. One, the particularity of this one that I'm using, turn taking versus collaborating, is its juxtaposition between those two ideas. How many of your students believe that turn taking is collaborating? Right? And that's a problem because probably all of them believe that that's collaboration. It's not, right? We have to move well beyond turn taking to collaborating. Now, how does this manage behavior? Well, let me ask you this. Which of your students are you having trouble managing? It's not the students with the marker, right? Close to all of the management issues you're having are coming from students who are waiting for their turn while they're working out a task, right? It's not the student with the marker who's the problem, right? Misbehavior comes from students who are idle while they're waiting for their turn. We have to break through this divide between turn taking and collaborating. We have to actually separate them and we have to move them from turn taking to collaborating. The other nice thing about this is that in its generality, this turn taking versus collaborating, in that generality, we have the ability to become incredibly specific, right? Because as I step in and interact with a group and I'm saying, what do you need to do to improve? And they're telling me, I'm able to write that down, right? So the specificity comes from the fact that this is so general. Now I've included a step-by-step guide that you just have to download, which tells you how to launch this and how to use it in your classroom and how to interact. And I include in here some look-fors that you can use when students don't know what to say, what they need to do to improve. But in general, this is a guide that's going to help you launch this in your classroom tomorrow. Now, the first week I used this, it was transformative. Right, I used it in 9 different classrooms in the first week, and I saw massive shifts in student behavior. I was in an 11th grade geometry classroom, and I had these 11th graders turning and facing each other and using each other's names as they were collaborating on transformations. Since then, I've used it in over 40 different classrooms from 2nd grade to 12th grade and in over 40 different workshops. And the results are amazing. And all the reports from the teachers who have started implementing this in their classrooms is the same. This is transformative. We are changing student behaviors immediately. And it doesn't have to be on day one of their experience of thinking classrooms. I'm working with teachers who have been doing it for 3 years who are going in and implementing it the next day and reporting back what a transformation it made on students who are already doing really well in thinking classrooms, right? So it doesn't always have to be turn taking versus collaborating. That's where I suggest you start. But I've also had a lot of traction with rushing versus going slow. So same thing. Gather the students at the whiteboard. Today we're going to focus on, I want to see you going slow. I don't want to see you rushing. Turn and talk. What is the difference? I draw the arrow, rushing on the one end, the end we don't want. going slow at the other end. And then, but this time, the prompt I give them is not only what is the difference, but tell me what are the advantages of going slow. And when they come back together, they're telling me, well, we're going to make less errors. We're going to think deeper. We're going to be able to include everybody more. That one is really critical, right? When we get the kids to slow down, everybody has a chance to participate. Everyone is included. And this is especially important for our language learners, right? It takes them longer to process the things that they're hearing. It takes them longer to come up with to articulate an idea, to formulate an idea, and then articulate the idea, right? They need everybody in the group to be going slower in order for that to happen. And again, we're going to set up this arrow. I'm going to interact with them. Are you rushing? Are you going slow? Often they're rushing and they're honest about it, right? Especially when we're thin slicing, they find themselves rushing. And when I ask them why, it's because, well, we all get this. And I say, are you sure you all get this? What is something you're going to do to make sure that you can slow down? And the things that come out this time are things like, we're going to ask more questions. We're going to check in with each other. We're going to get everyone to offer an idea before we write anything down, right? Like these are action items for slowing down. When they say we're going to slow down, that didn't work the first time. That's not going to fly. What is your action item? What is the thing you're going to do to make sure that you're slowing down? Now, on this one, you got to be a little bit careful because I did it in one classroom and the students went so slow that they actually got bored. So I have to put a modifier on it. Going slow enough. We want to go slow enough, right? Enough for everybody to participate, for everybody to offer an idea, for everybody to ask a question. Now, on this handout, I've included a whole bunch of different single indicator rubrics that you can use, and a couple of look fors for each one that you can use in case students don't know what to do. But I do suggest you start with turn taking versus collaborating. That one is critical in shifting the discourse and the mindset of what collaboration looks like in the thinking classrooms. So download the guide. It's going to help you implement this right away and try it in your classroom. And then let us know how it went.